This critical context presentation will be on Wendy Warren's book, New England Bound: Slavery and Colonization in Early America, which focuses on New England's place in the slave trade, their usage of chattel slavery throughout the 17th century. I'm going to go chapter by chapter through, starting with the prologue, which Warren uses as basically an abstract. Her goal, as stated outright, is to detach slavery in America from being about the cotton mill, which limits its scope from 300 to about 100 years, blackness, which excludes indigenous enslavement, and the antebellum South, which we use to excuse the North in a lot of cases. Slavery also directly benefited pretty much everyone in the colonies, and if not, was at least visible to them, and they were aware of it. A lot of the port towns were the primary means which goods were imported and exported out of the West Indies. And she also covers this topic of the land which they were colonizing being taken from the indigenous people with the express purpose of turning it profitable through slavery. John Smith, the same John Smith from Pocahontas, advertised New England for its cod and mundanity, not wanting a repeat of Jamestown, where a bunch of ill-equipped profiteers came rushing in looking for gold. So the context of the mission became a religious one, with Puritans taking up the mantle. Puritans were seen as not greedy and community forming, yet nevertheless quickly turned to slavery and supporting the slave trade between Brazil and Africa. New Englanders also took a different approach to the indigenous population, learning from the Spanish attempts in Central America, where instead of just converting them to Christianity or attempting to, they would just take their land and move those who resisted into slavery. Few attempts were made by the New England public to at all resist or take issue with the slave trade, other than a couple individuals and one attempt in Rhode Island to ban it, but this was by a couple of rebels. Because Puritans were seen as very adherent to the law, not wanting to defy both the written law and the word of God. As this quote suggests, slavery fit neatly into the scheme, the bottom rung of a ladder going all the way up to God. Enslaved people were always seen as at the bottom of the great chain of being. A couple of the laws passed were in 1641, there was a law allowing generational slavery, meaning slavery for life, even and a punishment for even existing as an African or native in the colonies. And another law in 1650 made slavery a legal punishment for crimes, meaning after being freed, slaves could be easily moved back into slavery through unfair application of the law. New Englanders also made some attempts to capture slaves in West Africa. A couple of the anecdotes listed were a killing of 100 coastal Africans to run off with 2 men as cargo, as well as several attempts to trap enslaved people or trap different Africans on the boats so they would lure others on, basically just trapping people and then shipping them off once they were satisfied with the number. Warren uses this quote, "The slave trade was just as much about cruelty as cupidity," or greed. Having only really cod and dwindling trade connections with the indigenous population, New England began to look for a cash crop. And obviously the first place they looked was getting involved with the sugar trade in the West Indies. A law passed in 1651, and New England basically became the sole power transferring goods between Barbados and England, goods including people. One of New England's primary imports to the West Indies was lower quality food that the colonists wouldn't eat, typically rotting vegetables or cod, and this would go on to feed the indigenous population. Warren describes this as food becoming racialized and uses the quote, "rotten calories fueled rotten labor," which I found quite poetic. Now being a generation in, a lot of the founding families of the colonies also began to intermingle and accrue a ton of political and economic power. The 2 big names she discusses are Winthrop and Hutchinson, same as Anne Hutchinson. Other names include Bradstreet, Mather, Paris, and Smith. So pretty much everyone we've read was a huge player in the slave trade. A lot of our documentation on enslaved people was from various wills, cargo reports, and just profit margins from these families. And we also see through stuff like wills how enslaved people were trafficked upon the death of a master, or in one case, an outbreak of smallpox caused a shipload of enslaved people to be sent to Barbados and shipped back for quarantine, during the passage of which a lot of them were ravaged or killed by smallpox. So a lot of the enslaved people endured this brutal passage several times in their life between New England and the West Indies. And during this time, a lot of them, like the second to last quote on the slide presents just how absolutely brutal this passage was and how anti-humanitarian it was, just to make them appear more profitable and suited for labor. The whole point of this section was basically to show how New England had a huge role in plantation slavery, even when no plantation slavery was occurring within the colonies. And then one last point she touches on is that there was a sort of replication of the culture of the wealthy, which I think Mai's covered. I'm not sure, where a lot of the poor, or I guess you could say middle class families, all owned at least one enslaved person as a house servant, just to mimic that lifestyle of the wealthy. This section has to do with indigenous enslavement, as early on a lot of the colonists had moral concerns with taking indigenous people as slaves. This was partially because they were seen as higher in the racial hierarchy or great chain of being than Africans, possibly because they demonstrated them as being converted to Christianity. I'm not sure, but a lot of the argument or debate was whether indigenous people were natural slaves, which is a concept from Aristotle. And as a side note, I've read this bit of Aristotle, and I believe he says women are also natural slaves, so take that as you will. The section brings up the praying town of Natick, and how despite a whole town of people being converted to Christianity, there were still attempts from surrounding towns to push into the land and claim the land. So it clearly wasn't a matter of whether they were Christian or not. The section also mentions the Pequot and King Philip's War, and how both were engaged in as pretty blatant land grabs or means of imprisoning indigenous people. We see, if you remember from chapter 1, you could be tried as an indigenous person and put into enslavement. So by engaging in war, you basically turn a ton of people into war criminals, as well as justifying, a genocide. And if that wasn't proof enough that this was a disguised genocide, there was this concept called a child of death, where indigenous children could be tried and enslaved / executed for the actions of their parents, meaning, your entire lineage was screwed if you were found guilty of something. And then one last thing is that the natives were deathly terrified of being sent to Barbados and Deer Island, so much so that they would purposely become enslaved by other native tribes. Deer Island being this, it's an island in Boston Harbor that's pretty much used as a concentration camp for Christian indigenous people during the King Philip's War. The next few chapters are about the lives of enslaved people within the colonies, but I'm just going to go through the notes I took on this section one by one. First, the flourishing of port towns such as Boston and New York was able to occur because of the profits incurred through the slave trade, which is upsetting living in Boston. Also reminded me of a point Mize made on the Industrial Revolution being able to happen because of the money produced for those countries by the slave trade. There's a point on slaves being taxed as property off their capacity to work, which meant that the government was directly benefiting from the continuation of the slave trade. Thus, it perpetuated itself as long as economics took priority over morals. Next, children of enslaved people were utilized for their capacity to do mundane work no one else wanted to do, which reminded me of the invisible labor and the role of the housewife and the Marxist view of capitalism. And then there's this point on Calvinists and Puritans facing this interesting contradiction where their holy text basically describes them being in bondage and being freed from it by God to find their holy land, yet they were enacting this on the Africans and indigenous people. And it's like, I'd love to hear from scholars at the time what they thought of this contradiction. There was this quote, "To be free in New England was still to remain enveloped in a thick web of social hierarchy," which was to say, even as freed men and indentured servitude began to become more common, the freed Black people were still subject to huge limits on their autonomy and the constant threat of being put back in enslavement by laws that made that legal. And then there was also this whole thing where enslaved people, in being present in houses, became partially responsible for domestic affairs, like between the white husband and wife who owned them. So by being witnesses, they somehow became responsible for stopping it, or sometimes were blamed and thus were accused in these cases. This section focuses on the relationship between enslaved people and family. The trial of Hagar was this case where an enslaved woman named Hagar was called to testify after she was raped and impregnated by her master's son. During her testimony, she revealed that she had been kidnapped from her family and sold into slavery completely illegally, yet both her pleas were given nothing, similar to Hutchinson, plus the intersectionality of her being Black. Even in trying to replicate family in this new world, it seemed completely out of reach of most enslaved people, partially because of the constant trafficking, partially because they were often whipped or punished for fornicating or birthing children. This is in tandem with the perspective of Samuel Maverick, who purposely and intentionally bred and raped his slaves for the purpose of creating more labor. So this concept of a hierarchical family, which we saw in Reuben, where culture is replicated through the parents above children, father above mother structure, was just completely unattainable because of the restrictions placed upon enslaved people by their masters, meaning there was no stable power structure that could be established between enslaved people, as we saw in Tituba. There's also this point where slave owners freed their slaves right before their sentence was up or when they grew too old to be productive, meaning that in their old age, when they needed to be dependent on someone, they were given nothing. And it wasn't until 1701 that this practice was outlawed. Just an interesting side note. This section's about how the law was used continually to encroach upon the rights of enslaved people within the colonies, or not only enslaved, but also freed Black and Indigenous people. In 1652, a law was passed requiring basically military service and for all enslaved people, or to be trained in arms in case of they needed to be militarized. This was revoked, however, in 1661 after a enslaved man committed suicide, both enacting his own freedom and destroying the property investments of his master in the most gruesome way possible. So enslaved people just weren't trusted with arms. This did have the side effect of making it impossible to charge enslaved people for cases involving firearms, however, because they were often seen as accidents. Arson was also another means that was obscenely effective at enacting revenge. Brain wrote that burning of houses and such like effects of unnatural envy would continue until the oppression and ignorance of the law of God were removed from the shoulders of the poor. This was not a common sentiment. After a case where a enslaved woman snuck out at night and burned the houses of two wealthy Roxbury families, the law was passed just not allowing any Black people to be out at night, freed or not. This had the unfortunate side effect of that a lot of these Black people face night terrors from the passages and abuse faced during slavery, so they were not able to go out and get any reprieve from it. And then in 1690, another law was passed, trying to reaffirm this, where all enslaved people were required to carry passes of ownership. This was passed with the intent of not allowing anyone to escape, but also had the side effect of basically stopping and frisking all freed Black men and women. Enslaved people also couldn't sell anything without, or sorry, not even enslaved people, I believe it was just Black people in general couldn't sell anything without written consent from a master, making a Black business impossible in this era. And then lastly, theft cases gave no benefit of the doubt to the enslaved for if they were being starved by their masters at all, and usually ended by charging the enslaved person with execution or further enslavement. So here we just see increasingly systemic means of panopticoning not only enslaved people, but free Black and Indigenous people. Chapter 7's about the first anti-slavery tract published by someone in power, Samuel Sewall, who was a judge in the Salem witch trials and famously the only one to apologize for it. His book, The Selling of Joseph, argued that all men were the sons of Adam and thus children of God that must be respected in that way. So he made two propositions. First was that an incredibly heavy tax be put on the buying and trading of enslaved people, 40 shillings, where one would normally be purchased for 25 to 30 shillings. And then he also asked Cotton Mather, who was a colleague of his, to send out a notice to slave owners throughout New England to convert their slaves to Christianity. This was not done with the intent of indoctrination. I would hope it was done to humanize them. Mather ultimately just did not oblige this request, and the tract was ultimately pretty unsuccessful. There was a man who criticized this tract named John Saffin, who was just some random slave owner, who responded with these morally insane but I guess logical arguments where he said, hierarchy is ordained by God, thus it must be retained no matter where. So slavery must exist no matter who the enslaved is, or you're denying God. He also said that he'd rather have white slaves than African slaves, if possible, because they're more productive. So he takes no issue with the point of Christianity. He's just purely saying slavery is good because it is ordained by God. The one outcome, arguably, of Sewall's paper was that a 1704 law passed, making freemen more free, I guess. They were required to do military and civil services at the state's request once a year, but were pretty much free from being put back in enslavement for the rest of their life. Finally, the epilogue just covers the fact that slavery was legally abolished in New England in 1783 due to the trade slowing down economically, but also due to the revolutionaries' rhetoric of freedom, just generally changing the public conscience on it. After 30 years, it seemed that a lot of the public consciousness started to shift away from the amount of pain that was enacted in New England and their responsibility in it. Warren pulls in this anecdote of a man named Nathaniel Hawthorne who visited New Haven, and just his encounters with these sophisticated black men, where he felt a likeness, a oneness to them, where he found it inconceivable that one could think to enslave them. Yeah, that's it. Here's my works cited, and thanks for listening. My voice is dead from doing 15 takes on each slide.